You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have Jay Wesley Richards. He's a research assistant professor at the Catholic University of America. We're going to be talking about his book, Eat, Fast, Feast. He's been an author of many other books, Money, Greed, and God, Privileged Planet, and The Hobbit Party, The Vision of Freedom that J.R.R. Tolkien got and the West forgot. So, Jay, thank you for coming. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it seems like you have a very wide range of topics you write about. What motivates you to write about what you've written about in the past and now?
Well, honestly, I'm by trade a philosopher, or at least by training. I teach in a business school. I'm really interested in the kind of intersection of philosophy and different public issues. So I've written on philosophy and science, theology and science, but really on the kind of intersection of ethics and economics. And, fitness and health has never been the thing I've written on. It's been my sort of avocational interest. I've been interested in fitness since I was in college. I was a fitness trainer and been interested in diet and wellness for a long time, and honestly discovered fasting sort of serendipitously, just really in my own life, and realized there's an amazing amount of information out there now. There's a lot of research about the physiological and the mental benefits of fasting. But as a Catholic, I knew that at least in the Christian tradition, most of Christian history has involved fairly rigorous fasting, but the only Christians that still consistently fast are in the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Rite tradition. So folks like the Greek Orthodox, they still keep a really rigorous fasting schedule. And so I thought this is interesting that you have this kind of historical practice, certainly among Christians, of rigorous fasting, both on a kind of weekly time scales and then according to the liturgical calendar, that's mostly died out. I mean, as Catholics mostly just kind of practice residual fasting now. And yet, completely independently, there's now more and more scientific research about the actual benefits of fasting. So what I really wanted to do is to combine those things, kind of make a case for why I think it's beneficial spiritually to fast and why it's beneficial physically. And actually that makes sense. If we're body-soul unities, you would expect that a practice like this might have both spiritual and physical effects.
Well, since you're a Catholic and it sounds like you studied, your own religion and others, how many religions talk about fasting or utilize it? At least, old school.
Yeah.
Is it present in many?
Yeah, in fact, virtually all of them. In fact, the only religion that I've been able to find that didn't have any kind of fasting is Zoroastrianism, which is a kind of ancient Persian religion. And there's still, I joke, I say, how many Zoroastrians have you met lately? I mean, there's a few 100,000, I think, of them still in modern day Iran. But all the major religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all have major fasting as a part of, as their tradition. And the Muslims in particular are supposed to fast every week, and then they're supposed to fast for a full month during the holy month of Ramadan. And these are both food and liquid fast from sunrise to sunset. So if you're a Muslim and it's Ramadan lands in the summer and you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you can be going 16, 18 hours a day for a full month. fasting. And last time I checked, Muslims still seem to get by just fine doing this. It doesn't have terrible physical, problems with it. And so I honestly got curious. Okay, what is it that we're doing, say in the 20th century, that has caused fasting to be so difficult? When if you look historically, at least in Christian circles, this was a serious thing that serious Christians did all around the world, really until the 20th century. And so I started thinking, okay, what is it that caused us to lose that? And that sent me down a rabbit hole about the modern American diet that I think is actually the main culprit.
Well, it seems like, I guess to me, the accessibility of food is just everywhere. And so you're able to eat all the time if you wish. And I guess, I don't know, if you get into that pattern, you get used to it, you just, you tend to eat all the time. And I remember myself, I guess I would worry if I hadn't eaten in a few hours, 4 or 5 hours. And I've heard that from many people. It seems like everyone's, intent on worrying about other people's eating. So maybe those are the factors.
They are. I mean, I think it's really a couple things. In some ways, it's sort of the blessing and the curse of abundance, because for most of human history, I mean, if you just think about normal patterns of eating, certainly prior to the agricultural period, so the hunter-gatherer stage of human existence, in which people might have a lot of food to eat. They might kill an animal and be able to eat a lot and would essentially feast on it. But then they might go days or even weeks without a whole lot to eat. And so that was the kind of natural pattern. And then even until recently, people didn't have Pop-Tarts and grape nuts available 24/7. And as you said, now, if anything, the kind of official scientific advice is to keep your insulin down and keep your blood sugar down and keep muscle on your body. You want to eat lots of small meals every few hours. And so both because there's so much food available for us all the time, and also because we actually think it's good for us, we've gotten ourselves into this pattern. And so a lot of this has actually just started since the 1960s. I mean, in the 1960s, the average American just ate 3 meals a day with no snacks in between. Most of us now effectively graze. I mean, I quite intentionally, for most of my adult life, had about 6 or 7 small meals a day. Some of those were protein shakes. I thought it was good for me. I thought that was the thing to do if I wanted to keep kind of lean muscle mass on and prevent my body from storing fat and things like that. And so that's really what I thought that I was supposed to do. And it turns out a lot of us thought that. It's just that the data now, if you actually look at the evidence, it turns out none of that's true. We don't actually need to eat quite frequently. There are certain macros that we eat. Oh, the other thing I didn't mention is that we have vastly increased the amount of simple carbohydrates and sugars that are a part of our diet, at least compared to kind of the historical precedent on that. So we eat frequently and we eat a lot of simple carbs and sugars, which tends to spike our insulin and eventually create so-called insulin resistance, which is not only bad for us long-term, it leads to bad things like obesity and type 2 diabetes. It also makes it really, really hard to fast, because if your body's used to getting sugar every couple of hours or every 3 hours, it's going to scream at you and want you to feed it again like a beast when you don't do that. And so this is what I concluded, is that in fact, are kind of what's so-called standard American diet, heavy on simple carbs and sugars and frequent eating, actually makes it much harder to fast. So if you want to make fasting part of your lifestyle, you're going to have to kind of reverse the way in which you're normally used to eating.
In terms of a fasting protocol, have you looked at both skipping entire days or multiple days, or going the 16 hours without eating every day and doing like the intermittent fasting version, where it's just a short eating window, time restricted feeding?
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm convinced that there are probably benefits to different time scales of fast. So if you think about the way our lives are oriented, we have patterns throughout the day, right? We are awake part of the time and are asleep part of the time. We eat part of the time. We don't eat part of the time. But there are also weekly patterns and monthly patterns. And in the Christian tradition, there are even seasonal patterns. So you have Advent followed by Christmas. So you've got a fasting season followed by a long feasting season, and then Lent, which is a long fasting season followed by Easter. You've got these patterns at different time scales. And as you mentioned, there are now these different kinds of fasts, so-called intermittent fasting or just time-restricted eating, where you just basically limit the number of hours you eat during the day, but you eat more or less every day. That by itself is already something different from what most of us do. But you can also extend fast. So, let's say a full 24-hour fast or a 36-hour fast where you don't do anything but drink non-caloric liquid, for a day or 2 or 3 days. And then you've got way out on the sort of extremes, you've got full week-long or even month-long fasts. I actually think there are benefits to having some of all of these. And so in the book, what I do is I actually lay out a 6-week plan designed both to help people sample these different kinds of fasts. So, maybe just time restricted eating for the first week or the second week, you'll just say limit your eating to an 8-hour window. And then the next week you limit it to 4 hours. And then the next week you limit it to just 1 hour during the day. So in other words, you eat all your calories or all those that you can eat during an hour of a day. And so it's only after several weeks of doing this that then I encourage people try to go for a full day or even as long as 3 days, that is 72 hours without eating. But if you do that correctly, and I also advise, at least in this transition to the fasting lifestyle, that you actually eat a very low carb diet. So a so-called ketogenic diet in which you get most of your calories from fat and some from protein and very little of your calories from carbohydrates. You do that in order to sort of turn online this other metabolic system that we all have but almost never use, called ketosis. And so our bodies are really they're like hybrid cars that can run on both gasoline and electricity. But in our case, our bodies can run on sugar, that is, we can run on carbohydrates, or we can run on fats. But as long as we've got sugar going into the system, your body won't use fat. So it will tend to store extra fat as body fat rather than using it as fuel. But if you restrict the carbs that are going in, essentially you use up all the carbohydrates in your liver and in your muscles, and then your body switches on this other system called ketosis, where your body converts fat either from your body or from your diet into something called ketones, and then your cells can actually use ketones as an alternative source of fuel. I actually think that physiologically, this is what's happening in all the studies in which you see benefits from fasting. What's happening is that your body is using ketones and causes a bunch of different physiological processes to kick on. And so I advise through this kind of 6-week period that you essentially start with just a little bit of time restricted eating, and then you work your way up over 6 weeks to, say a 3-day fast. And if you do it while eating ketogenically, your body will get much better at adapting to using fat, because the sort of long-term goal, I argue, is to be metabolically flexible. In other words, you want your body to be really good at being able to use sugar when sugar, that is carbohydrates, are available, but also to be able to kick into using fats when only fats are available, either when you're fasting or you're eating ketogenically. So your body is, I think, designed to be able to switch between these two modes, these two metabolic modes. But what most of us do for most of our life is we just stick with the sugar carbohydrate mode, and I think that's a problem. And so I really do think, it's kind of a long answer, but that there are actual benefits to these different time scales. So it makes sense that you would have a kind of a daily fasting schedule, which is effectively only eating only during kind of limited number of hours during the day. That gives your body a rest. It tends to keep your insulin levels really low. But then that you'd also periodically have longer fasts, so that maybe you go a day or two without eating at all.
Well, what do you hear anecdotally from people as they're doing the time restricted eating, and when they get to a certain point, like when they first started, what do you hear? If they get to the 1 hour a day part, what do you hear? And then the fasting part,
yeah,
what do you observe?
What I observe in a lot of this, as you said, there's an increasing amount of data. In fact, a lot of references from recent scientific journals up to about 5 days. And so we're finding positive effects, both sort of in terms of health effects and mental effects in terms of reducing body fat, up to about 5-day fasts. We don't have a lot of data beyond 5 days, just because that's really, honestly, frankly, it's hard to run a study where you're having people fast for 3 weeks, but there's a lot of data on time restricted eating, at least. So for instance, one study that restricts eating to 8 hours a day and another to 4 hours a day. And the kind of, to generalize effectively, the more you do this within limits, the better your body is at processing its calories, the more likely it is that you'll reduce inflammation, the more likely it is that you'll get actually really good triglyceride levels in your blood, and the more likely it is that you're going to keep your insulin levels down, which allows your body to use fat rather than storing it for fuel, and reduce obesity and then associated diseases like type 2 diabetes. I draw a lot on Canadian doctor, Jason Fung, who's done a lot of really important frontline research on this. In fact, he writes the foreword to the book, and he is finding success reversing not just obesity, but type 2 diabetes entirely with diet through a combination of essentially kind of low carb eating and fasting. And Dr. Fung actually will do fasts of up to 14 days, of course, under physician's guidance in order to do this. And so I think that's, at the moment, that is where a lot of the amazing effects of the physiological effects of fasting are happening. It's in treatment of type 2 diabetes and obesity, but I think that's just the beginning. That's where we have a lot of the data, but I do think there are also almost certainly effects in energy metabolism. There's some tantalizing evidence that it might even help treat certain kinds of cancer, and it certainly does something with mental acuity. In fact, that was what got me involved in this initially. I had a medical procedure and couldn't eat for 3 days, and I thought, oh boy, this is going to kill me. And right before I had the procedure, I'd gone a couple of days without eating, and I went to work out. And I not only felt strangely strong, but I had this incredible mental clarity that I had not really experienced before. And that's when I actually went online and discovered all the data on fasting. I think what your brain actually really likes to run on ketones. And so at the moment, we've got a kind of mix of scientific evidence of the physiological benefits of moderate fasting and some tantalizing hypotheses and anecdotes about other benefits that are going to probably take a few more years before we can nail it down scientifically.
Well, there's a lot of data, but do you speak directly to a lot of people that have gone through this or are going through it? And do they just tell you various stories that are interesting to you that stick out?
Absolutely. In fact, I've got a friend that's doing it right now, and for the next 6 weeks, he's going to go through my plan. And what people sort of overwhelmingly say is, yeah, at the beginning, it's sort of difficult for a few days until your body gets used to adapting to fat. But as soon as their body starts using fat for fuel, fasting gets a lot easier. And so hunger pains, for instance, are not the same as the kind of physiological need to breathe, for instance, right? We can all maybe hold our breaths for a minute, but every second after that, it gets harder and harder to do. And it's, you eventually will just simply, the physiological need to breathe will overcome you. That's not how hunger is, though. Hunger doesn't just keep going in waves. In fact, there's a kind of cascade of chemicals that essentially trigger hunger, desire, but if you don't eat, it actually goes away. And so your feelings of hunger will wax and wane. And so people that fast will notice that right at the beginning, if you're used to eating really frequently, you will feel kind of an intense hunger, and you'll be tempted to think that it's just going to keep getting worse and worse. But if you muscle through, those hunger pangs go away. And in fact, people that do prolonged fasting very often will say it's really after you get to the third day, it actually is not all that hard. It's 2 days of it. It kind of waxes and wanes and it gets really tough, but then the feelings of hunger go away. And I've discovered the same thing, having done this for a few years, is it's actually really easy to fast. I mean, today I'm doing a 24-hour fast, and I'll eat something tonight after sunset. But 4 years ago, if you'd asked me, I would be panicked that it's the middle of the afternoon and I haven't had anything to eat. I would feel that pain. I don't feel the pain at all. It doesn't bother me a bit. And so that's I think the kind of key thing is to realize that fasting, like any other thing, is actually a skill. And if you put in a little practice and implement some of the kind of basic procedures to work it into your lifestyle, it's actually not that hard. Now, yes, it's still a sacrifice. I've had fellow Catholics say, wait, fasting's supposed to be a sacrifice. Well, of course it is. If you're, would kind of like to eat and you're foregoing eating, it's in a sense a sacrifice. But a sacrifice is not supposed to be torture. I mean, if somebody said, well, I'm going to give some of my money every month to the poor rather than spending it all, that's a sacrifice. You're going to maybe not get to have as much stuff as you wanted before. But if every time they wrote a check to Goodwill or to the Red Cross, they got violently sick and nauseated and got migraine headaches, right? You'd assume, okay, well, it's supposed to be a sacrifice. It's not supposed to be torture. You must be doing something wrong. In the same way, fasting is not supposed to be a torture. It's a sacrifice. It's something that you have to willfully do, but it also has amazing benefits. And so if it's torture, that's probably a sign that you're just doing something wrong.
Okay. What has it been for you, like, as you've done it over I don't know how long you've been doing this protocol for, various protocols, but has it been months or years yet? How long has it been?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's been a few years actually now. I mean, and really quite strictly, it's been I'd say about 2 full years now of doing it. And so I'm not an especially heavy person. I work out 5 or 6 times a week, a kind of combination of high intensity interval training and weightlifting. So it's not like I was carrying around a whole lot of extra weight, but I do know that once I really started doing this, my body mass index and the body fat on my body went down and stayed down. So I'm basically the same weight that I was when I was a freshman in college. And so I'm definitely a little thinner. My brain works a lot better. Honestly, if the only physical benefit to fasting was just the mental clarity, I think that alone would lead me to do it, because, I write books and I have to use my brain, and being able to have mental clarity by itself is terrific. I also think it's really, really helpful spiritually. It helps for me when I'm fasting, it helps me remember to pray, which is something I otherwise don't remember to do. And I think because I think we're these kind of unique hybrids of the physical and the spiritual, it makes sense that a practice like this, which is at one level just kind of a deeply biological impulse to eat, should also have these spiritual implications. And so I found it both physically enriching, but also spiritually enriching. And again, it's not it's not surprising. What really was most surprising about this is that there would be so many physical benefits to fasting. I just had for a long time thought, well, it's something that spiritual superheroes can do, but it's going to be mostly torture, and it's not going to make you feel better. It's not going to be good for you physically. It's just kind of something you do. But to discover that, no, in fact, it has these blessings that it actually gives you physically, that's been the surprise for me.
What about your work during the day? Do you feel like you have too much time in your hands? Like what was eating doing to you during the workday? How was it affecting your workday, and what's your workday like now?
It's actually much more productive. I mean, that's the irony. Needless to say, if you're eating 6 small meals a day, you're having to pause and prepare and eat 6 small meals a day. And it's sort of commonsensical, but if you do a 24-hour fast and you just eat once during the day, there is a huge amount of activity on either side of that eating that you just don't have to mess with. You get up and just the kind of general preparation of those things, even if you're making a protein shake, it breaks up your day, especially if you need long periods of time where you need to concentrate. And so it's hugely time saving. And so actually in the book, the way the book is organized, it's across these 6 weeks in which you try these different procedures. And as things go on, in the 6th week, where people do up to a 72-hour fast, there are actually more chapters in that section, and I suggest more activities, because the reality is you've got a heck of a lot more time on your hands. And I know when I first started doing this, it was treated as a kind of a crazy fringe thing, and I joked from the beginning until now the book comes out. It started out as a kind of fringe thing. It's become almost fashionable. So even people like the CEO of Twitter, are now known to be kind of avid fasters. And so it's funny how the public attitude of all this has changed really just over the last couple of years.
It might be off topic, but you mentioned seeing instances of how religion interacts with science, or how religion comes up in science.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you about that, because it seems like science tries to squelch any mention of religion, and anyone that does mention it seems to be vilified and laughed at and all that. So do you find evidence that religion is still alive in science, and how has it manifested over the past few years?
Absolutely. I mean, there's this myth that religion and science are perpetually at odds, but I really think this is a myth that started in the 19th century. If you actually look at the founders of modern science, in fact, the founders of almost all the subdisciplines of modern science were actually very religious people. I mean, people like Isaac Newton, come on, the greatest scientist who ever lived, was also a devout believer in God. And right in the introduction to his Principia, he actually makes an argument from his science to the existence of God. And so I don't think, now of course there's certain manifestations of religion or certain manifestations of science that can be in conflict. But if science is just about the search for the truth about the natural world, as opposed to, say, being applied materialist philosophy, there's nothing about a search for the truth about the natural world that should be in conflict with religion broadly construed. And I think as a Catholic that these things are perfectly compatible as long as we define them accurately. And I don't think there's really any reason to think otherwise. And I mean, fasting is actually is a perfect example of this. I mean, something that for a long time was just a spiritual practice, it turns out can also have positive physiological effects that can be detected by science. Now, yeah, maybe science, the methods of natural science aren't adequate to detect exactly what's going on in the process of prayer, but the fact that we can discover that actually you're probably better off fasting, eating intermittently, that is, either than eating constantly, you're much better off physically. That's a kind of an interesting confirmation, at least of a practice that has been a major part of every religion. And so I really think this idea that science and religion have to always be at war, I think it's honestly just a myth from 19th century materialism. And there's no reason that we have to keep languishing under this idea in the 21st century.
Yeah, it just seems like people have gone way out of their way to say that religion has no place in science. It should be kept out. It shouldn't be mentioned or any of that stuff. And I guess I find personally, the more I learn about science and biology and how complicated it is, the more it seems to point to unbelievable complexity that just can't be random and have come out of nowhere. So that's just in my opinion.
No, absolutely. Yeah, there was this idea in the 19th century that everything had to be explained in terms of sort of blind and impersonal forces. But, just commonsensically, if you look at what's going on inside cells or you look at organisms, these things just scream purpose and design. I think that's also true in the human body. In fact, I have a chapter on the body's grand design. I think that our bodies are remarkably designed to be able to adapt to lots of different situations on the face of the earth. I mean, you've got people groups that do just fine eating basically seal blubber and seal meat year round, which I would not prefer. And then you get other people that seem to do just fine, and people groups living primarily on essentially on sweet potatoes. And so I think that that's a kind of a remarkable thing. This fact that we have this ability, right, to convert both sugars, that is carbohydrates, and fats into fuels, these two different substances that go through these two highly complex and coordinated pathways, and yet our body is able to use those for energy. All of these things they scream purpose and design to me, and I think it's only the kind of blinders of 19th century materialism that prevent us from seeing that.
Well, very good. So where's the best place for people to get the book? I bet it's probably on Amazon.
Yes, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Absolutely. And in fact, it actually doesn't come out till January, but people can, they can pre-order it. It's called Eat, Fast, Feast, because the book isn't just about fasting. It's about the fact that I think most of the time we're supposed to eat modestly and, in a controlled way. Some of the time we're supposed to fast. And I think some of the time we're supposed to feast. Some of the time, that is, we're supposed to celebrate. We're supposed to enjoy the abundance of creation and the many things we have. And I think that if we do that, if we live a life that's punctuated by these different ways of eating and behaving, I think we're going to live a much more fulfilled and much healthier life than if we do otherwise.
What chapter is the feasting chapter? And that's probably the chapter everyone wants to get to, right?
Yes, exactly. And I leave the feast toward the end. And so I really don't want people to just go straight to the end, though. You want to get to the feast from the eating and the fasting. And honestly, I mean, what's funny is that, for most of Western history, we have these feast days. I mean, every Sunday is supposed to be a feast day. Thanksgiving is a feast day. Christmas is a feast day. But the truth of the matter is we sort of feast all the time. That is, we sort of overeat all the time. And then on those feast days, we just eat even more than we normally do. And I can tell you from fasting for, a long period of time that if you really do fast in the lead up to, say, Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving, you will enjoy that feast a heck of a lot more than if you're already eating your fill right up until then. So in many ways, fasting actually helps us to understand and enjoy feast more than we would otherwise.
Well, excellent. Well, last question before we go. What's the hardest thing to you about fasting? What have you noticed?
The hardest thing is probably, in some ways, kind of the social aspects of eating, because, for most of Western history, or if you go to someplace like the island of Crete, where everyone still follows the Russian, or the Greek Orthodox feasting or fasting schedule, everybody's doing it. So the kind of social aspects of our lives are oriented toward that. But when you're fasting just as an individual and you're not plugged into a community that's also doing it, you can end up out of sync with people. So, maybe a dinner party lands on a fasting day or something like that, or you've got a lunch, right? Now I get lots of lunch meetings, and that's one of your fasting days. And so really the adjustment to that. And so that's why I actually think ultimately it's beneficial if there are cultural and religious traditions in which you were sort of part of there's a larger fasting schedule that's not just an individual thing. Without that, it requires it to be more of a personal discipline because your eating patterns may be out of sync with all the people that you live and work with.
Yeah, and I guess it'd be hard to sit there if everyone's eating around you and you not eat, not just because come on, eat something type thing, but just literally seeing them
hard.
eat.
No, absolutely. You're seeing them eat and you're drinking green tea or something like that. Yeah, it is sort of a stress. It is nice that I think this is becoming more popular. When I first started doing it, it was a bit eccentric, but more and more people are doing it. But we're certainly still not at the stage where, say, Western Europe was a few centuries ago, in which just literally everyone was following a fasting schedule. That definitely makes it easier.
Well, very good. Well, Jay, thanks for coming on. It's been a super interesting call. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.